I grew up watching my father sign checks he didn't understand. He would sit at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea, pen in hand, squinting at whatever my stepmother Carol put in front of him, and he would sign it. Not because he was careless, because he trusted the people around him completely, in that quiet, unconditional way that good men sometimes do to their own ruin. I noticed it when I was 12, the way he never read the fine print. The way Carol would hover just close enough to answer questions before he thought to ask them. I filed it away in the part of my brain that was already learning to read numbers the way most people read faces for what they were hiding. By the time I was 29, I did it for a living. Forensic accounting is not glamorous. There are no courtroom speeches or dramatic reveals. It is spreadsheets and ledgers and the particular silence of a room where someone has just realized you found what they buried. I worked for a firm in Charlotte that handled audits for federal contractors, and I was good at it. The kind of good that made partners pause when they passed my desk, that made junior analysts ask me to look at reports before they submitted them. Numbers didn't lie to me. People did, constantly and creatively, but numbers always told the truth eventually. My sister Brianna told people I was boring at parties. Brianna was 33, ran a lifestyle brand on Instagram with 200,000 followers, and had the kind of smile that made strangers trust her immediately. She was magnetic in the way that loud, beautiful people sometimes are impossible to ignore, exhausting to be around, and completely uninterested in anything she couldn't photograph. My father adored her. My stepmother Carol treated her like a personal achievement, the daughter she'd always wanted to claim as her own. I was the one who looked like my mother. Carol never quite forgave me for that. When my father had a minor cardiac event in October, not a heart attack, the doctors were quick to say, more of a warning, a flutter that showed up on an EKG, and scared everyone enough to take it seriously. It was me who drove the 6 hours from Charlotte to their house in Greensboro. Not because anyone asked, because I was the one who understood what a cardiac event meant for estate planning, for financial accounts, for the paperwork that quietly governs a person's life, whether they're thinking about it or not. Dad needed a durable power of attorney updated. He needed someone to go through his accounts and make sure everything was in order. Carol told him I was making a big deal out of nothing. Brianna texted me on the drive up. You always have to turn everything into a project. I didn't respond. I was already thinking about the numbers. I didn't plan to stay more than a few days. I had a lease in Charlotte and a cat named Hendrix and a drawer full of case files that needed attention. But when I sat down with my father's financial documents on the second evening and started going through them the way I always did methodically, without assumption, something snagged. It was a transfer, small enough to miss if you weren't looking. $4,300 moved from my father's savings account to an external account in early August. I would have dismissed it as a bill payment, except for two things. 1. The receiving account number didn't match any vendor or utility I could identify. 2. The transfer authorization bore my father's signature on a date when, according to his own calendar on the refrigerator, he was at a fishing cabin in the Blue Ridge with his brother and completely off the grid. I didn't say anything that night. I made a note and went to bed. Over the next 2 days, I found 4 more. The transfers ranged from $1,200 to $6,100. Some were months apart, some were separated by only 3 weeks. They added up to just under $47,000 over 14 months. And every single one was authorized with a signature that looked like my father's, the slight leftward lean, the way the R in Robert curved but wasn't. I had been watching my father sign his name since I was old enough to stand beside him at a table. I knew his handwriting the way you know a voice on the phone. These were close. They were very good, but they weren't his. I opened my work laptop and began building a file. This is what people don't understand about forensic accounting. The work isn't exciting. It's the opposite of exciting. It is the slow, meticulous process of documenting a reality that someone else has tried to obscure, building a record so complete and so clean that it cannot be argued away. I cross-referenced dates. I pulled account statements. I documented the discrepancies in my professional format, the same format I would use for any federal audit. By the end of the second day, I had 26 pages and a file with time-stamped attachments. On the third evening, I called my supervisor Marcus. He was methodical and calm and had spent 15 years in federal financial crimes before joining our firm. I told him what I'd found without editorializing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need to file a SAR, a suspicious activity report to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It was the standard procedure when a financial institution or a licensed financial professional identified credible indicators of fraud. It didn't trigger an arrest or an investigation automatically, but it created a record. A federal record, time-stamped and sealed, that existed independently of anything anyone in my family could say or do afterward. I submitted it that night. I didn't confront Brianna. I didn't confront Carol. I hadn't yet confirmed who was responsible, and even if I had, confrontation without documentation is just noise. I knew how these things worked. I had seen families unravel over money, had watched people rewrite history in real time when they felt cornered. I needed the record first. What I didn't anticipate was that Brianna would confront me. It happened on a Friday night, 3 days after I filed the SAR. My father was asleep by 9, tired from a physical therapy appointment for his shoulder. Carol had gone to her book club. Brianna was at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and her phone, and I made the mistake of walking in to get a glass of water. She looked up with that particular expression I had known my whole life, the one that meant she had been thinking about something for a while and had decided now was the time. "So," she said, "what exactly are you doing in Dad's files?" I set my glass down. "Organizing his estate documents. He asked me to." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You always frame everything like it's so official. You're staying in his guest room, not auditing a corporation." I didn't answer. She continued, picking at the stem of her wine glass. "You know, Dad mentioned you've been on your laptop a lot. He thinks you might be working your regular job from here and just calling it helping." "That's not accurate." She tilted her head. "Then, what are you actually doing?" "I'm making sure his finances are in order," I said. "It's what I do." Her smile flattened slightly. "And have you found anything interesting?" There it was. The question she actually wanted to ask, wrapped in performance. "I'm not done reviewing," I said. She stood up slowly, the way people do when they've decided to stop pretending to be casual. Her wine glass stayed on the table. "You know," she said, stepping closer, "Dad doesn't need you to come in here and make things complicated. He's finally stable. He's happy. Carol takes care of everything, and that's what works for this family." "I understand," I said. "Do you? Because sometimes I think you come home just to remind everyone that you're smarter than us. You sit there with your degrees and your little reports, and you look at all of us like we're subjects in one of your cases." I looked at her directly. "I'm not here to make anything complicated." She was close now, close enough that I could smell the wine. "You're threatening to blow up his life with whatever you think you found. I know exactly what you're doing." I didn't respond. I had been trained professionally, and by 29 years of living in her orbit, that the worst thing you could do in an escalating situation was match someone's energy. "You stayed calm. You stayed factual. You removed yourself." I picked up my water glass and turned toward the hallway. She grabbed my arm. I don't know if she meant to pull me hard or if the motion surprised her too. But her grip was tight and my footing on the tile was wrong, and I went sideways into the edge of the kitchen island. The corner caught the side of my head, above my right ear. The sound it made was the kind you feel in your back teeth. I dropped the glass. My knees went out from under me, and I was on the floor before I understood what had happened. The pain didn't arrive immediately. There was a moment of white silence, and then an intense pressure at my temple, and then the slow, warm feeling of blood. Brianna was standing over me, her hands still half extended, her expression cycling through shock and something that might have been regret before it settled into something I recognized better: damage control. "You slipped," she said. "The floor is wet. You slipped." I pressed my hand against my head. I could feel how serious the cut was by the amount of pressure I needed to apply. "Carol," she called, even though Carol wasn't there. She was already composing the story. I looked at my hand. I looked at the blood. Some part of my brain, the part that didn't panic, was already noting the time, 9:41 p.m. Friday. I reached for my phone with my free hand. I didn't call 911 first. I texted Marcus. "Incident at home. Head injury. Documents are saved and backed up to the firm server. Everything is timestamped. Calling ambulance now." His response came back in 40 seconds. "Go. I've got the file. Call me when you can." Then I called 911. Brianna watched me do it. Her face went through several expressions, none of which were concern for me. By the time the paramedics arrived, my father was awake and in the doorway looking terrified. Carol had come home and was talking in a low, urgent voice to Brianna in the living room, and Brianna was describing to anyone who would listen how I had simply slipped on the wet floor, how the kitchen tile was always dangerous, how she had tried to catch me. I didn't argue with her. I gave the paramedics my name, my symptoms, and the mechanism of injury in plain, precise terms. The paramedic, a young woman with tired eyes, glanced at Brianna and then back at me and didn't say anything, but she wrote something down. At the hospital, after the CT scan came back clear but showed a minor concussion, and after the cut above my ear had been cleaned and closed with 4 sutures, a Greensboro police officer came to take my statement. His name was Detective Araujo. He had the particular patience of someone who had heard many versions of many stories and was waiting for the accurate one. I told him what happened, not with emotion, with sequence, time, position, contact point, result. I told him about the financial documents too, and about the SAR I had filed 3 days earlier. I told him where the files were saved and who at my firm could verify them. I gave him Marcus's number. He looked at me for a moment. "You filed the report before this happened?" he said. 3 days ago, I said. "It's already in the FinCEN system." He wrote that down. My father sat in the waiting room the entire time I was being examined. When I came out, he stood up and his face looked older than I had ever seen it. He had a blanket around his shoulders that some nurse had given him, and he looked at the bandage on my head and his mouth worked for a moment without producing sound. "I'm okay, Dad," I said. He pulled me into a hug that was tighter than I expected. His hands shook. Carol had not come to the hospital. Over the next several days, the investigation did what investigations do when the paperwork is already in order. It moved. Detective Araujo contacted FinCEN. FinCEN confirmed the SAR. Marcus provided the firm's documentation, properly formatted and time-stamped, which outlined the 14 months of irregular transfers in clinical detail. The hospital provided the medical report. The paramedics' notes were consistent with my statement. My family's version of events did not have the same infrastructure. Carol called me twice, both times with a voice full of practiced warmth, telling me that Brianna was beside herself, that it was all a terrible accident, that families needed to handle these things quietly rather than letting strangers get involved. I let her talk and did not engage. When she finished, I told her I was following standard procedure and that she should speak to an attorney. My father called me once. He didn't ask me to drop anything. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I was. He was quiet for a long time and then he said, "Livy, how bad is it?" "With the money." I told him the number, $46,840. The silence lasted almost a full minute. He said, "I didn't sign those." "I know," I said. He said, "I thought she was doing well." "I know you did," I said. Brianna didn't call me at all. The assault charge moved faster than the financial fraud investigation, which was expected. The physical evidence was clean. 4 sutures and a concussion, a medical report that contradicted the wet floor narrative, my statement, and the paramedics' notes. The DA's office filed a misdemeanor assault charge within 2 weeks, but when the financial fraud component surfaced and investigators confirmed that Brianna had forged a federal account authorization, the DA amended the charges: forgery of a financial instrument, bank fraud, and theft over $10,000. Felony level. Her lawyer, a man who sounded exhausted on every call, attempted the familiar progression. First, it was an accident. Then it was a family disagreement that got out of hand. Then it was that I had provoked her, that I had been making accusations, that I had created a hostile environment in my own father's home. He filed a character statement that described me as combative and obsessive about finances. The detective forwarded it to the DA, who told Marcus it was the most counterproductive filing she had seen in 2 years. Carol wrote a letter to the court describing me as someone who had always been difficult, who had never fit into the family, who had a pattern of creating conflict. She said Brianna was under enormous pressure. She said I had never been supportive of my sister's success. Her letter was added to the case file. It was not particularly useful to Brianna's defense. My father, when asked for a statement, drove to the DA's office and gave one in person. He was quiet and measured and told the truth. He had not authorized the transfers. He had not known about them. He was present at the fishing cabin on the dates in question and could provide a witness. He said Brianna was his daughter and he loved her, but that he could not stand in the way of what was factually accurate. He called me that night from his car, still in the parking lot. "I should have paid more attention," he said, "to all of it. There was nothing I could say to that wouldn't be painful, so I said, 'You couldn't have known.' You see things I don't," he said. "You always did. I used to think it made you difficult." He paused. "I think I was wrong about that. I didn't know what to do with that sentence there. so I held it quietly and told him I would call him over the weekend. The court date arrived on a gray Tuesday in February. The courthouse in Greensboro was ordinary in the way that places where serious things happen often are: fluorescent lighting, scuffed floors, a smell like old coffee, and central heating. I sat beside the DA's paralegal, a composed woman named Dana, who had called me 3 times with updates and never once used unnecessary language. Brianna came in with her lawyer and Carol and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be Carol's sister. They sat on the opposite side of the aisle, and Brianna did not look at me for the first 10 minutes. When she finally did, her expression was one I had seen before at every dinner table disagreement, every Christmas when I said something that deflated the performance. A look that said she still believed this would resolve itself in her favor. It was the look of someone who had never had their narrative actually challenged before, just deferred. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the kind of economical attention that suggested she had heard every brand of family drama and was not moved by any of it. She looked at the documents the way I look at documents for the actual information. Brianna's lawyer made his argument. He spoke about remorse and stress and the complexity of family dynamics. He spoke about Brianna's social media presence as evidence of her community contributions, which the judge did not visibly react to. He said the assault had been unintentional and the financial matter was a misunderstanding born of caregiving, that Brianna had been managing her father's affairs with his implicit knowledge, if not his formal authorization. The judge looked at him over her glasses. Did his implicit knowledge include 14 months of undisclosed transfers to an account in his daughter's name? The lawyer adjusted his tie. The judge turned to Dana, who presented the documentation. She did it the way good work should be presented without theater. Time-stamped file submissions to FinCEN, bank records. Signature analysis conducted by a certified examiner that identified statistically significant deviations from my father's authentic signature on all 5 forged authorizations. The medical report. The paramedic's notes. The detective's summary. The judge read in silence for a long time. The room was very quiet. Carol's sister was holding Carol's hand. Brianna had stopped looking confident. She looked, for the first time since I could remember, like someone who was genuinely afraid of what was coming next. The judge set down the documents and looked at Brianna directly. "Do you have anything you want to say to this court?" Brianna exhaled slowly. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she spoke anyway. "I was helping my dad. He never paid attention to any of it, the bills, the accounts. Carol and I were managing everything, and I took more than I should have. I know that. But it wasn't stealing. He needed help." The judge let the silence sit for a moment. "Your father was at a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains when you signed his name to the first authorization. He needed help from 150 miles away?" Brianna's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The judge looked at the medical report, then back at Brianna. "And regarding the assault, your sister sustained a concussion and 4 sutures to the head. The paramedic's notes indicate no water on the floor and no evidence consistent with a fall." "It was an accident," Brianna said. Her voice had gone thin. The judge nodded slowly. "That word," she said, "seems to follow you." She closed the folder and folded her hands. What followed was not theatrical. The judge did not raise her voice or deliver a speech. She simply read her ruling with the flat precision of someone documenting a conclusion they had reached well before they walked into the room. On the charge of assault causing bodily harm, guilty. On the charge of forgery of a financial instrument, guilty. On the charge of theft over $10,000, guilty. Sentencing would follow a pre-sentence investigation, but the judge recommended incarceration and full restitution. Given the premeditated nature of the financial crimes and the presence of forged federal account documents, she noted that additional charges through the U.S. Attorney's Office were not outside the realm of possibility, and that she would be forwarding the case summary accordingly. The lawyer tried to speak. The judge held up one hand. "I also want to note for the record," she said, looking briefly at Carol, "that the character letters submitted on the defendant's behalf, which described the victim as combative and obsessive, were filed regarding a woman who identified financial fraud before she was physically harmed, reported it through proper federal channels, and gave her statement at the hospital 4 hours after receiving a head injury." She paused. "I would ask the family to reflect carefully on what they submitted to this court." Carol looked like she had been doused with cold water. Brianna was shaking her head slightly, the same way she always did when reality wasn't going her way. Her lawyer was whispering something. She wasn't listening. I sat very still. Dana leaned over and said quietly, "Good outcome." I nodded. Outside the courtroom, my father was waiting on a bench in the hallway. He hadn't been allowed in the gallery given that he was also a complaining witness in the financial matter. He stood up when he saw me, searching my face. I told him the charges and the verdict. He sat back down heavily. His hands were clasped between his knees and he looked at the floor for a long time. "I don't know how I didn't see it," he said. "You trusted her," I said. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "but it is a reason." He looked up at me. "What happens now?" "The sentencing is in 6 weeks. The restitution will come from her accounts. Whatever can't be recovered comes through civil claims." He rubbed his face. "I'm not worried about the money." "I know," I said. He reached out and put his hand over mine the way he used to when I was small and something had frightened me. He left it there for a moment. "I'm sorry, Livy, for not seeing it sooner." I looked at our hands. "Dad," I said, "I've been looking at numbers since I was 12. You shouldn't have had to." He nodded but didn't look convinced. We sat there for a while in the hallway, not saying much. Through the courtroom doors I could hear low voices, the shuffle of papers, the particular sounds of an ending. I didn't need to hear what was being said. On the drive back to Charlotte, I stopped at a gas station outside Burlington and sat in my car for a few minutes with the engine off. My phone had several unread notifications. One was from Marcus, heard from Dana. Clean outcome. Take the weekend. One was from my father. Sent 20 minutes after we had said goodbye. Call me Sunday. One was from Carol, with a subject line that said, "This isn't over." I opened Marcus's message and replied, "Thank you." I opened my father's and replied, "I will." I opened Carol's and archived it without reading past the subject line. Then I started the car and drove home. Hendrix was on the couch when I walked in, unimpressed by my absence, which was his default setting. I fed him, opened a window, and made a cup of coffee I didn't really want but needed to do something with my hands. The apartment was quiet in the way it always was, clean lines, no photographs on the walls except one of my mother and me at a beach somewhere in the Outer Banks when I was 7, both of us squinting into the sun. I sat by the window with my coffee and looked at nothing in particular. The verdict was the right one. The paperwork had done exactly what paperwork is supposed to do when you build it correctly. I hadn't needed to fight or perform or convince anyone of anything. I had filed a report and documented a timeline and told the truth without decoration, and the system had processed it and returned an accurate result. That was how it was supposed to work. It didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel tired, and then, slowly, something closer to still. 6 weeks later, Brianna was sentenced to 22 months in a minimum security facility and ordered to pay full restitution of $46,840. A restraining order was issued prohibiting any contact with me. The federal referral resulted in an additional proceeding that added a supervised release period. Her lawyer filed an appeal that was denied 4 months later. I received the notification about the appeal denial in my work email, forwarded from the DA's office. I read it at my desk between 2 other case files. I flagged it for my records folder, added it to the physical file I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet under the tab labeled Caldwell, R, closed, and got back to work. My father called every Sunday, like he said he would. At first, the calls were short and halting, full of the particular discomfort of a man who was trying to say something he hadn't said in years. Gradually, they got longer. He told me about his physical therapy, about the fishing cabin, how he was thinking about going back in the spring, about a neighbor who'd gotten a new dog, small things. The kind you share when you're trying to rebuild something one quiet piece at a time. I didn't ask about Carol, he didn't offer. In March, I was promoted to senior investigator and given my own caseload and a new title on my office door. Marcus brought a small cake to the team meeting and made a speech that was characteristically brief and accurate. I thanked him and ate my cake at my desk while reviewing a flagged ledger from a contractor in Virginia. One afternoon in April, I drove back to Greensboro for a weekend, not for any event or occasion. My father had asked if I wanted to come for Sunday dinner, just the 2 of us, and I had said yes. The house looked the same. The oak tree in the front yard had budded out with that particular pale green of early spring. Dad opened the door before I reached the porch, like he'd been watching from the window. We ate at the kitchen table with the good plates he usually saved for company. He had made pot roast and didn't apologize for it, which was progress. We talked about ordinary things, my caseload, his blood pressure numbers, a book he was reading about the Korean War. After dinner, he brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me and said, without prelude, I've been thinking about what I should have done differently. I wrapped my hands around the mug. Dad, you don't have to. Let me say it, he said. I spent too many years keeping the peace in this house by ignoring what was actually happening in it. I thought I was protecting everyone. He paused. I think I was protecting myself. I looked at the table. He said, You were never difficult. You were just honest. And I made you feel like that was a problem. I didn't have a prepared response for that. I had spent so many years not expecting it that I wasn't certain what to do with it now that it was here. I nodded, because it was true, and because some acknowledgments don't need to be argued with. He reached across the table and put his hand on the back of mine. Briefly, the same gesture as outside the courthouse. We finished our coffee. I washed the dishes. He dried them and put them away in the right cabinets, which he always seemed mildly surprised to remember the location of. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one in the early dark. When I left, he stood on the porch and watched me back out of the driveway. I rolled down the window. I'll call you Sunday, I said. He smiled. I know you will. On the drive back to Charlotte, the highway was quiet and the sky was that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before full dark. I had my window cracked and the radio on low and Hendrix waiting at home, unimpressed as he always was. I thought about something Marcus had said to me once, early in my career, when I was second-guessing whether a report I'd filed had been worth the disruption it caused. He said, Your job isn't to decide what people can handle. Your job is to document what's true. I had carried that with me ever since, not as an excuse, as a compass. The numbers had always made sense to me in a way that people hadn't. They didn't perform. They didn't cover things up out of loyalty or habit or fear. They just held what was put in them and waited for someone to look. All I had ever done was look. I merged onto the interstate and set the cruise control. The city lights of Charlotte appeared on the horizon a long time before I reached them, just visible against the dark, a warm cluster of something familiar, something mine. I thought about the file in my bottom drawer with the tab that said closed, and felt, in the silence of the car, that it was the right word, not finished, exactly, not resolved in every dimension, just closed, the kind of ending that doesn't announce itself. It just stops hurting, one quiet day, and you realize the silence has changed its character entirely. That it sounds, finally, like the life you actually chose.